hour. We're doing it for about 45 minutes, depending on how many questions there are for ECN 211 here at ASU's Global Freshman Academy. Here I am, live in person. You've seen me maybe on a couple of videos. I'm Bart, I'm your professor. My last name is Hobijn, but since that's hard to pronounce, I just go by my first name. So this is the, you're working through the first week, which is kind of a double whammy in the sense that the first part of this first week consists of a set of prerequisites that that you can look at to see whether you are well prepared to follow this course. And the second part of this week, which is really parts 1.1 and parts 1.2, introduce you first the first part to the outline of the course in part 1.1, and in part 1.2 we're looking at what's the main measure of the size of the economy, namely gross domestic product. I'm checking one technical thing here for 1 second. If you are interested, you can use the chat function on this Hangout to look at, to ask questions while we are on air. And if you are interested in following up on questions that you have on this office hour, you can do this on the discussion board. We will have weekly office hours here every Thursday at 8:30 Unified time zone, and that's at 1:30 here Arizona time. So let's talk a little about why this week consists of the prerequisites, and then we can talk through what we are going to do in parts 1.1 and 1.2 that some of you are working through already, I've seen, and many of you will probably do in the later part of this week. So the prerequisites part of this course is really here for you to check whether you know the basic things that you need to know in order to take this course. Now, if you make a mistake here or there, that's not a problem at all. But if the material in that part looks really unfamiliar, we would strongly encourage you to pick that up first and spend some time on that, and then revisit this course later on. It will be offered again on edX. And so it's for you to test whether you're ready to take the plunge and actually take this class. Once you are, then you're going to make it to parts 1.1 and 1.2. On the prerequisites part, let me emphasize one thing, which is there's one thing about facts and fiction and opinion. That is something you can pick up really well, clearly during the course. The most important thing is that you understand how to read graphs. You understand what an x-axis is, what a y-axis is. You have some sense of what a straight line is, and you'll see them often enough again that you can pick up the details while you go through the course, but you have to have a basic understanding of these concepts before you start. So reading graphs is going to be a big part of this class. And then there's things about calculating percentages, growth rates. We will help you with that. The course is full. There's a tool that helps you do this percentage calculator that's being covered in the prerequisites. But we do expect you to have a basic understanding of these things before you jump into this course and you start working on it. That's on the prerequisite side. So work through that, make your own judgment, whether you want to continue or not. We'd love to have you in this course. We're excited to be offering it to you, but we do want you to take it when you're ready for it. And that's hopefully this helps you judge whether you are or not. So then the second parts of this that we're covering this week, which are parts 1.1 and parts 1.2, those are really the part of that cover the first content of the course, and that are also going to be covered on your midterm exam. The structure of these parts, someone asked on the discussion board, is this course going to be similar to these parts? Is yes. The structure of these parts is very representative of the rest of this course. Every week we'll have 2 parts to it. So next week we'll have part 2.1 and part 2.2. They all consist of a little video and then subsequent modules, interactive learning units with text and charts you can move around and data you can explore, so that you get a very hands-on experience. But it does involve probably a little bit more reading than some other online courses that are more video-based. As you see from this part of the course, the reading, it's not only reading, it's also that while you're reading, you can fill in the questions that are being asked such that you can kind of figure out as you go along whether you understand what you're reading or not. The students that have read this course, they spend about 5 hours on it. So about 2.5 hours on each part, about 5 hours on each week. But they had already completed the principles class. It will probably take a little longer for you, and then you also have to do the assignments. So it is a substantial commitment. Here every week. We're here on the discussion boards. We're helping you along. So if you're up for it, stick with us. So parts 1.1 and 1.2 are representative for the structure of the course. And so let me talk a little bit about what's in them, where I think you can focus on a lot in these parts, and maybe for those of you who haven't gone through everything yet, go through it and with the help of some of the guides that the hints that I can give you. So what I will do is I will share my screen with you. Up. So what I will do is I will share my screen with you. But let me first check whether the video is working. So I'm going to talk about part 1.1, sorry, which is really an overview of this course. Let me see this. I apologize that I might run into one technical difficulty here, and I'm going to check that out for a second. Okay, so part 1.1 for the course here is covering the outline of the course, and that includes basically an overview of the structure of the economy. And we're going to do this course really very much by the structure of through the structure of the economy. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 main sectors in the economy. That will be households, which you're going to work on next week. Firms, which also going to be working on next week, and you're going to learn how to think about what households decide to do, how much do they decide to buy, how much do they decide to work, how much do they decide to save. And then the other thing you do is you're going to learn how to think about what firms do next week. So that's also covered in part 1.1, where we briefly discuss what firms do, how they invest in goods, how they capital goods that they use to produce stuff, and how they hire workers. So that's an overview. We will dive into great detail on that as we go along in the further weeks. So really part 1.1 is an overview that tells you what's covered in which week. What I hope that you get from that is you get a sense of the basic structure of the economy that we're going to think about, and some of the basic terminology that we're going to use while we are working our way through this course. Now, remember, this is a preview. You don't have to know everything. So, for example, one question on the discussion board was, why do we have trade if we want everything to be so American? That's for those of you who are here in the US, just like me. But the answer to that question, which is a very, very valid answer, a very, very valid question, will come up when we do the details about why it would be beneficial to trade and not to trade. That's a question that is really about the last week of the course, so you'll have to wait a little until March, basically, until we get around to looking at the answer to that. But we will get to that in the 7th week of this course. So, but the most important thing that I want you to get out of part 1 is just enjoy the examples, read through the material, understand kind of the basic concepts, and try and do the practice problems. You have an infinite number of tries for them, so you can do them as well as you want, and as often as you want, rather. And see whether you understand the basic terminology and the basic structure that we're thinking about, how we think about the economy, how we think about supply and demand in markets. All of these things will fill in the details, but they're useful to look at in part 1.1. Once you have that overview down, which is, it's pretty straightforward, but there are a couple of details that are useful that are covered in that part. Then we're really going to dive into the details. And the first thing we're going to do is ask ourselves, okay, if we talk about the macroeconomy, we're talking about the sum of what everyone does. So the question then is, how do we measure the sum of what everyone does? And the answer to that is we measure it by summing things up. So we're summing up everything that everyone buys, households, firms, as well as foreigners and the government, who form the other two sectors in the economy. We sum that up and we measure something called GDP, the gross domestic product. It's the value of all the goods and services that are being produced within a country's borders. So that is one way of thinking about the economy, is to think about the size of all the spending and the money that people and businesses and the government and foreigners actually spend. Now, the other way of looking at the size of the economy is to say, if I spend something and I give my money to someone, then it's income for that other person. So the other way of looking at it is to look at income. And that's the second thing we're going to look at in part 1.2, and that's called gross domestic income. What is important for part 1.2 is to understand that there's basically 3 ways of measuring the size of the economy. What we produce, we actually sell. So people spend money and businesses are spending money on that. So what we produce or spend. And then the third one is what people earn from all the spending that's being done in the economy. Now, once you understand that there's 3 ways of looking at this, then the final thing that you really want to start doing is understanding why we think this is such an important measure for the economy. And here it is important to realize what the difference is between money spent and the amount of stuff bought or produced. So there's a difference between dollars and quantities. And that's what the second part of the second section of part 1.2 is about. So the third section of part 1.2 is about, which it distinguishes between a dollar measure and a quantity measure. A dollar measure in economics is called nominal, and a quantity measure is called real. So the measure that we care most about is called real GDP. It's the measure of the quantity of stuff that's being bought and produced in the economy. So let me show you kind of the basic charts that go with that. So here's the overview of the course outline, and I'm going to go with you into the part that is most important here, which is to think about nominal versus real GDP. Let me zoom in on this so that you can see it as clearly as you can. You see, if I spend $10, but I can only buy one tomato for it, the $10 sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually not adding up to a lot of goods. So even though the money amount of $10 is high, the amount of goods that I get for it for my own personal benefit, for my food benefit, for my food consumption is very little. Versus if I could buy 4 tomatoes for $10, then I would get 4 times as many in terms of the quantity. So what do economists do? And we'll see this a lot in this course. So let's talk through this. What we look at is we think about the total amount that you buy. Think about going to the supermarket. You have tomatoes in here, peanut butter, milk, things like that. You put them in your shopping basket. So that's basically what's in your shopping basket. And the things that you have in your shopping basket have a price tag. So this is the price tag. So the total amount, the bag of money here, what you spend out of your wallet or on your credit card or however you buy this stuff, the total amount of money is the amount of stuff that's in your basket, price of that good. So what economists do when they look at economic activity is we kind of know the dollar amount of how much people spend. And we do know, because we go out and we measure prices. We know what the price of tomatoes is here in Phoenix. We know what the price of cucumbers is in New York and how it goes up over time. We know what the price is of hiring a lawyer or going to the dentist. So we look at those things so we know how the prices go up. So what we then do in reality is we're going to look at the size of the economy and we're going to split it up into a price and a quantity term. And then we're going to ask ourselves, how quickly does the quantity amount increase? So the reason I'm showing you this slide is it's not in levels, it's in changes in growth rates. So we're going to look at how quickly does the quantity amount increase. And the way we do this is we measure a dollar amount. We know how much the amount in dollars increases, and we know how much of that increase is actually due to the change in prices. But we don't care about the change in prices, so We deduct that, and then we're left with the change in GDP that's simply due to the change in the quantities, which is known as the change in real GDP, or the change here is a growth rate, so it's measured in percentages. If you look at the three of those things, this is the left-hand side variable, real GDP growth. This is the first variable on the right-hand side, nominal GDP growth, so it's the changes in the dollar amount. And the red line here is the growth rate of the prices of all the goods and services that are part of GDP. So as you could see, this blue line is the difference between the red line and the yellow line. Now, what I want to focus on is this blue line, because I want to talk through how that makes us think about the economy as a whole. Here's that blue line. This is real GDP growth in the US. If you're interested in it, you can zoom in if you want to in these charts, and you can zoom out. You can also move the chart. You could look at the data by clicking the Data tab, and you can also look at the information and the notes. But let me focus on this figure, because I wanted to use this to talk about the three big questions we have in economics. The first is this: as the unit that I pulled this from describes, unit 1.2.33, look at that. This is how quickly, so this is a growth rate, so it measures how quickly overall size of the economy changes. If it's positive, then the economy becomes bigger. If it's negative, like here, the economy becomes smaller, like in 2008. So in 2008, but also in the early 1980s, as well as the early 1990s, you see that this GDP growth is dipping below zero, and the economy actually shrank rather than increased. But overall, as you look at this blue line, you see that this blue line is actually above zero most of the time. And thus, overall, on average, the economy tends to grow over time. So why does it grow, and what determines how fast an economy grows? That is the first question that economists ask themselves. This is the first main question. It's the question about economic growth. Now, the second question has to do with when we compare the United States with other countries. Now, in order to do that, we have to ask ourselves another question about real GDP. When we actually look at real GDP in the United States, it's real GDP that is made by give or take 330 million people. Now, Luxembourg doesn't even have 1 million people in it. And so if we would just look country by country, a large part of the size of the economy is determined simply by how many people live in it. But if we want to compare economies kind of apples to apples, we want to think about how much we actually produce per person. Now, there's another famous economic variable for that we cover as well in part 1.2, namely real GDP per capita. So let me show you real GDP per capita. I'm clicking through to that part of the course, so that's why I'm trying to figure out where the slide is that I'd like to show you. So the first thing that I'd like to show you is real GDP per capita in the US. So here's a plot from the lectures about real GDP. This is the level of real GDP. So this is the level of real GDP, the blue line. So what I showed you before is the growth rate in this. And then this red line is the level of real GDP per capita. There's a couple of things here that are interesting to cover that you go through in the notes as well, but let me just cover them with you. The first is that I've normalized them both to be 100 at the end. So this is not the value of real GDP. I just set this to be equal to 100. It's an index number where the base period is the last observation here, which you can see in the data tab. It's 2016 Q3. So what does this thing say? If we just look at GDP in the United States, it was about 12% of what it was in 1948 Q2. GDP was about 12% of what it was in 2016 in the third quarter, because this number is 12.09, and that measures GDP 1948 Q2 as a percent of GDP in 2016 Q3. That means GDP in the US is going up by a factor of 8. But per person, GDP has gone up less because the US population has grown. So we're basically sharing the 8 times bigger GDP with more people. So think about it this way. If you go to a birthday party and there is a pie and 2 guests, you get half a pie. Now, suppose you go to a birthday party and there are 3 pies, but there are 12 guests. Yeah, the number of pies has tripled, but the amount of pie per person is actually less because you only get a quarter pie. So that's kind of what this thing is reflecting. It's reflecting the effect of the increase in the population. Now, I will talk about these little bumps in the gray areas later on, but overall, what you really see is that even if we take the increase in GDP, part of GDP growth that's due to the population growing out of it, we're getting a substantial growth in real GDP per capita. So the amount of stuff we produce and the number of goods and services we produce per person is also increasing over time. That's the first thing to realize, and that really is about standards of living. We are better off, tend to be better off, most of us, on average, are better off than our parents, our great-grandparents, our grandparents, and previous generations. Now, whether this will continue or not is a big question, but it's definitely true. It's definitely been true historically. But now another astounding thing is to compare these real GDP levels across countries. So in one of the other units that we're doing, in the next unit on GDP per capita, we actually compare this across countries. And again, in this case, we normalize the United States to 100. And for example, we find that the amount of GDP per person in Canada in 2014 was about 81%. So Canadians were about 20% less in terms of GDP per capita. But there are also countries that have a higher GDP per capita. So the idea that the US is the richest country in the world is not completely correct. But there are countries, at least when we measure it in terms of what we produce per person, that produce more than the US do. Norway is one of them. I mentioned Luxembourg before. You have to really, really, really do your best to find Luxembourg on this map, which is hard to do. But it actually is one of the highest levels of GDP per capita. And even some countries in the Middle East that are very oil-rich have a higher GDP per capita than the US. But most countries have much lower GDP per capita in the US. So for example, Russia's GDP per capita is about half of that of the US. And that's equivalent to kind of the level of GDP per capita that was in the US in the 1960s. So the Russians, in terms of GDP per capita, are about 50 years behind the level in the US. These are astounding differences. In some countries, in sub-Saharan Africa, we might make some measurement error there because it's not always clear what GDP is. But even if you take that into account, GDP per capita in Africa is much, much lower, 1/50th. In some countries, even less than 1/50th of that in the US. So we're talking about levels of GDP per capita that we haven't seen in the US basically over the last 2 centuries. Now, the next thing I want you to take away from this, and the final thing, so this is the this is the second big question for economists, namely, why are some countries so much richer than others? And then the final question has to do with not the level of GDP over time, but why GDP is not constantly growing over time. Why does it fluctuate over time? For that, let's go back to our plot of GDP growth. Here's the plot of GDP growth, and you really see these periods where GDP growth is negative. And we tend to call these periods recessions. They're the exceptions. The rule is generally that GDP tends to grow over time, but there are periods where it fluctuates. The fluctuations in GDP, for the periods where GDP tends to decline, we have a name for those. Those are recessions, and we tend to mark them by something called recession shading. So let me show you that. You'll see plenty of recession shading in this class. Oh, I thought that I could see recession shading here, but it's to the next unit. My apologies. So when we look at that same plot of GDP growth, we can put bars here in periods where economic activity, those gray bars, where economic activity tended to decline. So those are periods where the economy actually gets smaller, it doesn't increase. Those are also periods associated with a lot of people losing their jobs, because there's a decline in overall production, so the fewer people are needed to produce, people who then lose their income, so they will have a problem paying off their debt and their loans, and there's a whole cycle associated with this where many people incur a big cost to the disruption to the economy that occurs during recessions. So the third question that economists ask is, why do these recessions occur? What's the cost? What's their cost? Who suffers from them, under them? And then how can we prevent them from happening, or at least alleviate them, make sure they're smaller? And that the final question comes down to trying to what we call stabilize overall GDP growth and overall economic activity. So policies that try to alleviate the size of recessions are called stabilization policies. Well, those are the three big questions. Why are we getting basically richer and richer per person over time? Why are some countries so much richer than other countries? And then the final one is, why is economic activity moving up and down over time? And those up and down movements are called the business cycle. Those are the three questions we will basically focus on this whole semester, or these whole 7 weeks that we're working on this class. Now, it's important to realize one thing on this is in order to understand why GDP grows, why some countries are richer than others, and why GDP moves up and down over time, we kind of have to understand which decisions make up GDP. And as you have, and as you'll see in part 1.1, we're going to look at the decisions of households to work, or on the one hand, and then once they earn income from working, what are they going to spend? Whether they're going to spend their money today, or whether they're going to spend it tomorrow, so they save it and they spend it later. We're going to look at the businesses' decision on how many workers they want to hire, how many machines they want to have in place to produce the output they produce. I'm going to look at the government's effect on the economy. What's the effect of the government deciding to build roads, to have Medicare and Medicaid, for example, things like that. And so we will look at the impact on that on the economy, because all of these decisions add up to GDP. So to understand all of these three big questions, very, very big questions about GDP, we have to understand the main decisions that underlie the amounts that add up to GDP. So that's what we're going to do. Where this class is different from a lot of other macro classes is that next week really is the week where you learn the core economics behind those decisions. You'll learn them interactively, but we're actually going to do something different from what most macro classes do. In most macroeconomics classes, people talk about macroeconomics all the time, which is the sum of what everyone does. What we're going to do next week is we're going to look at the sum of what households do and what firms do. So we're going to look at this. We're going to sum up over everyone. But we're first just going to look at one individual, Adam, which is our main character during this course, and look at his decisions, and then kind of try to put ourselves in his shoes when he decides how much ice cream to eat, which is his consumption, and how much he wants to work in order to be able to afford that ice cream, as well as if he runs a business, how many people does he want to hire to produce ice cream, and how big is the machines that he wants to install to produce ice cream. So we're going to look at Adam's individual decisions, both as a consumer as well as a businessman. Those two individual decisions then learn us a lot about, once we add up over many Adams, what would come out for the whole economy. So work your way through this week and think and our measures of GDP. But don't forget that at the end, it's all about the decisions that make up GDP. And understanding those decisions in order to understand macroeconomics as what we'll do in this class. The next week is going to be probably the toughest week in this course because it covers a lot of material. But I hope you enjoy it. I worked really hard, and we all did as a team here at ASU. We worked really hard to make these things lively and fun, and especially also very interactive, so you can try things out and learn by experimenting. So next week we'll look at those particular economic decision problems of consumers and firms. But until then, let's call it a day and keep on working on this. If you have any questions, we're here at our end answering your questions on the discussion board. I'm happy a lot of you introduced yourself, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the questions you have and the things you're excited about. If you post on the discussion boards, please use your first name and introduce yourself not only on the discussion board when you introduce yourself at the beginning of the course, but also post your first name so we can answer it just like we would do in a normal classroom to keep the course as personal as we can. Okay, I'm looking forward to all your posts on the discussion boards, and well, I'll see you next week. Bye.